Good afternoon, everyone. All right, welcome to the UT Energy Symposium. My name is Michael Weber, introducing today Bill Cannon, our speaker from the Sumitomo Corporation of Americas. For those of you who don't know, Sumitomo is a 400-year-old company in Japan.
Right.
In its modern incorporated version, almost 100 years old, that is active in many spaces, including energy, water, food, other infrastructure. Bill Cannon here is the Senior Vice President and General Manager of the Environment and Infrastructure Group for Sumitomo Corporation of Americas, headquartered in New York City. So appreciate you coming in and making this trip. They also have offices in Houston and elsewhere, so they're active in a lot of places and regions that some of you will know about. His bio was sent out, so I won't read all of it, but he's got a background in mergers and acquisitions and investment banking, a lot of finance background, and has been at, well, Sumitomo, you said about a decade, is that right?
About a decade now,
About a decade, and responsible for a lot of renewable energy projects and other things that we care about for this class. He'll be talking about today adapting from grid to energy cloud. And after this, so I think he's got a shorter presentation than time for Q&A. After that, we'll go to Schultz's Beer Garden. So anyone who wants to join us is invited to join us for some drinks and food and conversation. I know some of you are on the job hunt, so maybe you should come there for a drink and hit him up for a job, and we'll see what happens. So Bill, thanks very much for joining us.
All right.
And we look forward to your comments.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah. All right, well, so as Michael said, I'm Bill Cannon. I manage our infrastructure assets for Sumitomo Corporate America, and we have roughly about $1.5 billion of investments since I've been there, so over the last 10 years in the infrastructure space. People utilize the word infrastructure pretty broadly. We define it as basically what you see up there on the screen. We define it as power, renewable energy, solar, wind, gas or thermal generation, and also some water and wastewater businesses. And we have a few rail infrastructure assets as well. So just a bit of background. I got into the, I'm a power guy by training. I came into the industry right out of undergraduate. I went to University of Pennsylvania, graduated the Wharton School, and also I got a BA in Japanese language, of course, sort of surprising. I'm at a Japanese firm now. And went right into power plants and the financing of power plants. I worked for a small company called Fieldstone, and they did primarily what's called project finance. It's a very highly specialized type of financing at that moment in time used specifically for power plants and aircrafts. Spent a good many years there, and then went to Columbia for my MBA. From there, did investment banking, mergers and acquisitions at Rothschild, mostly in the utility, the power, and also the infrastructure space. So have a wealth of experience. Joined, as Michael said, I joined Sumitomo about 10 years ago, more or less around the time of the financial crisis. So first, as you might expect, a quick advertisement, a quick overview on who Sumitomo is. We are probably not that well known, but we may be well known for some of the products or some of the companies that we do own. My group is in the middle there, the infrastructure business unit. Again, as I said, offshore wind, water, and stuff like that. But we also do metals, transportation, media, lifestyle, and mineral resources. Some of our main businesses here in the United States is the import of titanium tubular steel for the oil and gas industry. That is probably the bulk of our business. But then we also own a tire company, a tire distribution company, Big O Tire, Tire Kingdom. I don't know what's here specifically in the Austin area. We also own Hart's Mountain, if you guys have a pet cat or a dog. It's a food product company, food stuffs. Also, it's actually largely a pharmaceutical company. They make the flea and tick collars if you have that. So we are involved in many different aspects. So our centennial, as Michael said, is coming up. So our 100-year birthday is coming up next year. And as a firm, we sat around and said, you know, what really are our core values and what is driving what we are doing? And we came up with these 6 material issues. And there's 2 that our group really embodies, and that is the first one there on the upper left corner, achieving harmony with the global environment, and the upper right, contributing to the development in local communities and industries. And so this is really where our infrastructure group focuses its time and effort. If you had asked me 5 years ago to describe our business, I would have thrown up a chart that looks like this. I would have said, okay, here are all the power plants that Sumitomo owns throughout the world. You can see there in the U.S., almost all of those investments were made while I've been there, and I led most all those acquisitions. We also developed some of the assets as well. So we've been really focused on growing our portfolio. But this is sort of the old way that I would describe our business. And if you were to ask me today to describe the business, I would give you a completely different answer. But before I get to that, before I get to the answer of how I would describe our business, let me sort of give you a little bit of how or why we think our business is changing. So to begin with, this is the traditional way that most people in the United States receive their electricity. There is competition at the supplier level. It goes to the transmission network, to the distribution, to your home or to your business. This is a very stereotypical way. The generation supply was deregulated back in the 90s, and that's basically when I started in the business. So helping companies to start building the first of the competitive supply. The generators sold their power to almost exclusively to utilities, and the utilities then sold it to customers. But again, back in the 90s when I started in the sector, they weren't customers, they were ratepayers. And that's the terminology everybody used. And then that's a key aspect here that I'll touch on in a moment or two. But this traditional style of the way that electricity is being distributed to the ratepayers is under a tremendous amount of pressure from different forces, and it's really going to change the way that the business model of the utility will change. And there's 4 key elements to this that I'll describe in the next slides. The first change is the fact that renewable energy has come to the U.S. in a very big way. And you can see that in the past few years, and it's projected to grow out in the next 7 or 8 years, that we're going to be adding about 15 to 25 gigawatts of new renewable generation every year. You can see that some of the bars are taller than other years, and that is mostly driven by federal tax policy. You can see the year 2013 was a terrible year, and it was because of the tax incentives had expired in that year. They were reauthorized, but basically that's what drives the ups and downs. But one thing that you can clearly note that in 2020, when the tax benefits for wind, which is the blue bar, expire, there's a dramatic cut down in how much is going to be installed. And it's really solar, commercial, residential, utility scale. That's just depending on how big the units are. You can see that solar is really going to begin to dominate the market. The offshore wind, you can see it's projected to be pretty small going forward. And that is just a reflection of the U.S. industry. But as you all probably know, it's quite large in Western Europe. Actually, Sumitomo owns about 5 assets right now in the offshore wind space. And my hope is that it grows much more than what people are projecting, but costs are high compared to onshore wind, and the U.S. has plenty of space really to put onshore wind. So the solar dominance, specifically when the wind starts falling off, is driven by the cost curve. Right, the price for new solar has been coming down dramatically, even since I've been in the industry. So in 2012, it was about $2.50 per watt. And it's now, and this is Bloomberg's forecast, but my experience is it's now under $1 per watt to install. This is utility scale, so this is not exactly what's on your personal roof at your home or at a company or a store, but on utility scale, which means a larger installation. And that's going from $2.50 to $1 to under $1 in just 5 years. That is a dramatic cut in prices. And you can see that Bloomberg is forecasting that it's going to decline probably another 25% over the next 5 years or so. What is not shown in this chart, of course, is politics, right? Is the wild card as to what happens from our government. And though I can tell you that right now it's under $1 for the new installation cost. Panel prices are subject to tariffs. Steel and aluminum are subject to tariffs. Steel and aluminum is basically what the solar panels rest on or they're supported by. And so the expectation is that it probably will rise a little bit, maybe 10%, maybe 15% this year as a reflection of the potential for tariffs to be implemented. The other way to look about the effective costs here of solar is what's called the LCOE, which is the levelized cost of electricity. It's basically once you build it, what can you sell the electricity for to either an end user, to the wholesale market, or to anybody really. And Bloomberg here is estimating it to be about $40. Again, my experience in the United States, it's probably closer to $30. Again, it depends on where your solar project is. It depends on the solar resource. It depends on many different factors, but I think 40 might be a little high for the U.S. But with that said, there's been some really notable auction processes in other countries with respect to solar that has really brought the cost down. In Chile, they had an auction over the summertime, and the price came in at $21.50, which was at that time unheard of, the lowest price ever. And then immediately followed thereafter in October, Saudi Arabia did one, and they came in at $17.86 for the levelized cost of electricity. Again, you could say, well, it's Saudi Arabia, it has a great resource, which it does. Actually, the white sands in Saudi Arabia allows for the solar panels to have collection on both sides of the system so that it can get the sun and the solar resource that's bouncing off the ground. So you can say, yeah, it makes sense. I can understand 1786. And then Mexico, they had an RFP and they came in at $17.70. Again, the lowest ever. And Mexico's basically just like the United States, right? Its solar resource is highly similar to what we have here, very similar to what we have here in Texas, more specifically. And so, why can people develop projects in Mexico at $17.70, but I'm struggling to develop projects at $30, right? So there are differences here in the cost. Government policy does play a significant factor in that. Labor costs, of course, is another large component to that. Land prices, interconnection costs, et cetera. But it's, again, the solar is essentially changing the way that we think about power going forward. And solar also has the potential to do what's called distributed generation, which is basically generation where it's consumed, right? So that instead of having a big hulking coal fire station in the middle of nowhere that has these long power lines that go out to New York City, to Chicago, to the big load centers, you can put the solar panels right where they're used. And that is one of the significant drivers that is going to be changing not just the industry, but is putting tremendous amount of pressure on the utilities to change their fundamental business model. The next big change in this sector has been the advent or the rise of corporations buying wholesale power, or sometimes retail, but it's typically wholesale. And so for many years, it was nothing. It's just not a concept. And then in 2013 is when it really started to take off. And this was led by tech companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, companies that wanted to project a do-good type attitude or atmosphere. And they had commitments, these great goals to become 100% green, if possible. With Sumitomo, we worked with the Mars company. Mars is the company that does Snickers, M&Ms, and the like. So in 2014, we signed an agreement. So we're part of that grid there on 2014 to sell them wind power from a project in a town called La Mesa, Texas. It's not that far from Lubbock. And Mars was truly the first company that wasn't a tech company to do something like this. And it's really groundbreaking to think about what they did. Mars procures and goes out and buys cocoa. They're actually a big pet care company. They buy necessary ingredients for dog food or cat food and the like. They're a big pharmaceutical on the pet side. They buy the necessary ingredients for that. And having them to start thinking about procuring electricity as though it's a commodity was a big step change. And for Sumitomo, it was a big step change to say, okay, I'm not selling to a utility anymore. I'm selling to a customer. And their needs are dramatically different from what a utility would think about. And the last major change that we see coming forward is electric vehicles. Now, this is still a little bit, out of the four major changes, this is probably the one that is still the slowest to really take off. And you can see that it's relatively speaking, it's pretty small scale in terms of the number of vehicles sold per year. But the electric vehicles, not just in the consumption of electricity, but they have the potential to have a profound impact on the transmission and the distribution grid on the localized level. Now, how long electric vehicles take to really be wildly adapted, I don't know. That's anyone's guess there. I mean, people have been saying the next 5 years, but they've been saying the next 5 years for about 10 years now. So it's really hard to say when this is going to be a much more significant force. So, what I wanted to convey today is that the business model, the way that utilities make money, is going to radically change with this energy transformation. Previously, the mantra was be affordable, be safe, be reliable. When someone turns on the light switch, have the electricity there. That's all they wanted. The public utility commissions, every state has a public utility commission. Their goal was to make sure that customers got electricity. That's it, that it was safe and reliable and affordable, right? So what they did is they looked over the shoulders of the utilities and said, okay, you can do better in terms of your outages. You can do better in terms of your costs. But that's where they focused. But those four major changes, and I've sort of condensed them over there in the driver's section, these influences are beginning to change the way customers want to buy electricity. Fundamentally, you have the customers that are saying, this is not good enough. This is not how I want to purchase my electricity, right? Their electric company doesn't cold call you and say, hey, can I come to your house and tell you about electricity? That isn't a thing yet, right? But companies are beginning to demand that they get called on for their electricity like they get called on for, what copier are they going to use, what paper products, who's going to deliver their office goods. They want basically to have a customer service agent to come to them and start selling them products. Technology. We're at the early stages of how technology will change the utility sector. We're not quite there yet, but we can start seeing the trends. You can start seeing some technologies come that will have the ability to fundamentally change the whole equation here. And that technology will then impact how utilities are operated. How is the electricity gotten from the source to the consumer? And that's where technology and operations will go hand in hand. The policy and regulation, this will be what I perceive as to a sort of, not a stumbling block per se, but it's going to be an inhibitor to the progress going forward. The regulators have the ability to go very fast. They have the ability to make it go very slow. And so the way the regulators structure the sector, the way that they respond to customer needs, to the needs of the utility company themselves, to the shareholders of the utility, that really will influence the speed or the timing of all this. And so we'll see new emerging styles of individualized products. That means so that I might buy a different product than you might buy. I might go to, or my electricity company might come to me and say, what would you like to buy? Do you want to buy a single stuffed Oreo or a double stuffed Oreo, right? We're going to walk down the aisle of a supermarket of electricity and be able to choose our different products. We want flexible. We want to be able to say, I want my electricity delivered at nighttime, or I want it delivered at the daytime. I want more flexibility about how this electricity comes into my home, or comes into my office, or comes into my factory, or whatever it may be. Sustainable. I mean, this is just bar none. I mean, companies are demanding sustainable electricity. There's no question about this. This, to me, is one that is already here and it's going to stay. If you go to a company and say, hey, I can sell you some coal-fired generation, you're going to get no takers. Trust me on this one, right? But if you go and you say, hi, I can sell you green electricity, I can sell you solar, I can sell you wind, you'll have a receptive audience. And then autonomous, and this is basically companies having the ability to have generation at their own site, that they can control their own destiny, so to speak, when it comes to the production of electricity. And all of these factors are coming together to create this sort of necessary mix for the next phase of the energy transition. So some of the key themes that we see really happening here is first distributed generation, as I said, and this is principally solar. There could be new technologies that come out that may impact this as well. There are certain types of wind turbines that are safe to come up to on a close basis or to put on the roofs. Vibration with wind is a big issue, so putting it on rooftops is very hard. So it is possible that wind technology moves into here as well. But with today's technology, this is principally just solar. And as I said before, clean energy and decarbonization, these are major themes already. Intelligent choices, this is technology, this is smart grids. Smart grid is the ability for, if there's a power out or a line down, a transmission line down, whatever it may be, for whatever reason, the ability for the grid to self-heal. To say, okay, this road, like Waze, if you will, right? If this path isn't working, let's go this way, let's go this way, let's go that way. It's a ways for technology to move around when there's disruptions. Smart meters. The smart meters exist today, but they're hardly at all rolled out. And a smart meter is a meter on your home or your place of residence or your company, and it's based on time of day, so that if you utilize electricity at, say, noon, your price is going to be different than if you utilize electricity, say, at midnight. One of the impediments with smart meters is, well, first you have to roll them out. I mean, the existing meters are sometimes good enough, right? So there's always the challenge of, well, why do I need it to be any more than safe, reliable, and durable? But for the transition to happen, we need smart meters. People need to know that if you buy electricity at this time of day, it's more expensive than if you buy it at that time of day. And this is when the consumers, this is when the peaks of the energy cycle, the daily energy cycle will start changing as people understand that the price of power changes throughout the day. But if you get one price from your utility, you don't care, right? There's no incentive to change. And with smart meters, that creates the incentives because you will see it in your monthly bill. AI and IoT. IoT is mostly, if you look at the smart house there, it's basically the devices within the house suddenly all start talking to each other. Most people are aware of Nest. Nest would be one of the major items to or a product like Nest, where you have your thermostat talking to your smart meter. I mean, it has to require a smart meter for sure, but your thermostat, your washer, your dryer, your refrigerator, your AC unit, all of this talking to your smart meter and determining when they should run based upon the price of electricity. But none of this can happen until the consumer, till the customer is aware that there are actually price differential out there. And vehicle to grid. This is actually where Sumitomo thinks the biggest change will happen. But it's dependent upon quite a few things. One is, first of all, more adoption of electric vehicles, naturally. And change in the marketplace, change in the rules. This is, again, where the regulators have to come in and change the way that things happen. But basically, the concept is that you have an electric vehicle, you plug it into the grid. The grid operator then can utilize the battery that's within that electric vehicle to support, stabilize, provide electricity to the grid, or take electricity from the grid when there's too much on the grid. And so one vehicle, probably won't make much of a difference. But if you start accumulating, 10,000 vehicles on a grid in, say, New York City or in Houston, then you're going to have a material impact on the way that the grid operates. Right now, you need a lot of things to happen. As I said, the regulators, you need to be able to have a way for the person that owns the vehicle to get paid. There is no way today. So it requires regulatory change, which can be fast, can be slow, depending on the regulators. And I think the V2G, vehicle to grid, is probably going to take off a little bit more in Europe, where the regulatory system is a little bit more favorable to electric vehicles, but also just generally speaking to renewable energy. So to circle back to what I was saying at the beginning, how do I define what Sumitomo does now in the energy sector? I still will probably start with the map of our assets. That's very natural, right, to sort of show what we own. But then I might say, well, we also do some energy retailing, so we sell directly to consumers. Well, okay, we also have some battery technology. We have frequency regulation. It's a type of battery that is utilized in the northeast of the U.S., and it helps to stabilize the grid. Well, okay, we do distributed generation. Yes, we put solar panels on companies and on their rooftops or next to their facilities. Okay, well, we also do EV sharing. So we have a car sharing company that we just invested into, all electric vehicles. Right now, that's all it is. But once V2G actually happens, having fleet-wide of EV will really help us move into that sector. Well, we also do fuel cells, microgrids. Microgrids are when you take for us specifically, the way we define it is you take a very small area, usually a small island nation or a small island itself, and you have a grid based upon solar and batteries, but it's just self-consumed in that area. Just as a side note, a utility in Vermont is pursuing a microgrid operation. It's a small utility, about 60,000 customers, but they're trying to move forward on this concept, and it's going to be groundbreaking if they're able to move this through. But it's utilizing the batteries that someone else has bought for their home or for their company, wherever they may be, utilizing the solar panels on their roofs or wherever they may have the solar panels, but allowing the utility to utilize all of this as a resource. We do smart scooters. This is electric vehicle scooters, mostly in Asia, where you can just pop out the batteries and go to a gas station, get a new battery, just pop it in, and you move along. It's as easy as changing the battery in a remote like this. VPP, this is what's called a virtual power plant. It's pretty similar to a microgrid, but it doesn't have to be self-contained as a microgrid is. We recycle batteries utilized in electric vehicles. So we utilize it with our microgrid. So the battery technology we have for our microgrid is actually the batteries from used Nissan Leafs. What do you do with a Nissan Leaf? What do you do with a car battery once it's past its useful life? And so we've been utilizing it as a grid-based battery source. We're beginning to own some charging stations. We're making some investments in energy tech and IoT. And hydrogen, this also could be a game changer. Right now, it's hard to say where hydrogen will go, but hydrogen, at least the way that I would understand it, and for this, is that hydrogen is a battery. It's a source. It's a way to store electricity. You take electricity, you convert it to hydrogen, you store it, you can then take that hydrogen and convert it back to electricity, or you can use it as you might use natural gas. You can burn it, you can combust it. And hydrogen, again, it has great potential, but all of it is still a little bit unknown at this point. So what is next for the industry? Where is this all going? What are we going to be doing from here? And for those that are students here, where do you go? When you graduate from here, what's the right industry to go to? How do you capitalize on all these changing trends? What is a sustainable business model for a utility or for someone in the energy sector? Where will the new profit centers be? And all of this I can't answer because all of this is just too hard to say at this moment. There's too much technology flooding this sector that it's hard to pinpoint who is going to be the winner, who is going to be the loser. But with that said, let's give it a go. So here I have this is just a typical schematic of what you might think a smart grid might look like. On the left here, I have the centralized power plants. They're not going anywhere. We will still have centralized power plants in the United States for another 20, 30 years or so. We still need the reliable, dependable electricity that comes out of these plants. Transmission and then distribution. This is going to be a little bit challenging because as customers either decline in their utilization of electricity because they're getting smart about how they use their electricity, or they start with the distributed generation, they're going to need less transmission and less distribution services. So that basically the amount of electrons going over the wires is going to be reduced. If you're a utility and you are based upon cost of service, you're based upon how much throughput you have, and your throughput goes down 10, 20, 30, 40%, what do? I perceive that the transmission and distribution utilities will have a very, very challenging time going forward. Because for them, you can't just say, well, my throughput went down 50%, so I'm just going to double my rates and I'll be fine. It isn't that easy. You have to go to the regulator. You have to say, may I please double my rates? And the regulator will say no. And then what do? So this is going to be an extremely, extremely challenged sector. And this is where, if you want to say what is stopping this, right here, transmission and distribution. This is what's going to stop the energy transformation. It's going to be entrenched companies, utilities, government, regulators, politicians that come and say, no, I like it the way it is, don't change it. And so I can really see that some of the transmission and some of the distribution going into the hands of municipalities, going into the hands of nonprofits, community-based organizations. Here in Austin is a little bit paradoxical, but so put Austin Energy aside for a second. Most of the rest of the country has utilities that are for-profit to make money, but it's very conceivable that the transmission and distribution will go the way of the local roads in your community. They're owned by the town or the city or the county. Your sewer system or your water system is owned by the town. That's probably how this is going to go because it isn't a sustainable business model going forward. And selling power to the customers will really begin to be the profit center of the sector. So going to a customer and offering them a variety of services, a variety of goods, that is where I see the profitability going from the sector. It's going to move away from generation. It's moving away from transmission to distribution. It's going to be to the person that, if you will, that owns the customer, that has that customer relationship. That is really where I see the value coming. Now, that doesn't mean they get to capture all the value, right? Any smart company will try to take away that value from that company. And so it's going to also be the technology providers. The two top things there, the utility company data center and the energy management system control. This is the technology. This is the new technology that's going to come into the sector. This technology isn't here yet, or at least if it is, it's not widely utilized. And this is where a lot of the money in the industry will go, a lot of the capital investments will go into the technology sector, and this is where a lot of the profits may come. But it's going to be challenging. How do you know if company A is better than company B? You just don't know that quite yet. And so this is where the uncertainty comes in. This is where you'll have some failures, some company failures. But this is also where when a company does succeed, it will really succeed quite nicely. And then, as I said, and Sumitomo's opinion, in my opinion, the vehicle to grid also will take off as well at some point once EVs are widely adapted and once the technology there and the regulators change. But you can see it coming. Might not be 5 years, might not be 10 years, but you can see that the groundwork is being laid today for this area to grow. So let me just stop there and just wrap up here. I know I didn't give any answers as to what the energy cloud will look like, but at least I wanted to give you some trends that are impacting the industry so that you can see where these trends, or that you can guess or hope where these trends might end up. The only thing I can say is that in my 20 some odd years in the sector, first 15 years nothing happened. I mean, it was boring. We did the same thing day in and day out. In the last 5 years mostly, there has been just such radical change in this sector. And it's really, it's in my opinion, it's really quite exciting and quite a great place to be at this time. So with that, let me end and open it to any questions you might have. There's a microphone coming down to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Guys have they kind
Yep.
and then Warren said because
Mhm.
where is that going to happen? You know.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, well, I'd first say that Warren Buffett owns Pacificor, Nevada Energy, and Mid-American Energy. So he owns more than just one utility. He owns quite a few. Yes, so
But who doesn't own multiple utilities, right? So it's
right. So wind, there is a place for wind, yes. But wind only blows in the mid-continent of the United States. So from Dakotas down to Texas, right? That's where the wind is generated. And to get the wind to where it is consumed or utilized, you do need these big transmission pipes, these big transmission grids. And they are being built. But you also are seeing some resistance. You see people in Kansas say, well, wait a minute. Why should I allow my utility to build a transmission network for this wind to go to Chicago? Why would I do that? How does that benefit people in Kansas or in Missouri or in whatever? But you're starting to hear people push back a little bit and say, well, wait a minute. I don't want to build this big transmission line because I don't see the benefit. This is what the regulators are saying, or the utility management say. So you're beginning to see a little bit of reluctance. And to answer that, they're building these big DC. So transmission is typically AC. So you're seeing some DC transmission wires that just go right from the wind, bypassing everything else and going straight to the load pockets. But wind, the challenge to wind is that, at least in today's technology, it is not distributive. You don't have just one wind turbine somewhere. You have wind farms, you have big projects, you have 200 megawatts, you have large enterprises. And again, I think there will be a place for this, don't get me wrong, but it's solar that you can have 1 megawatt or a half a megawatt or a quarter of a megawatt. Or you can also have 100 megawatts, right? So solar is very scalable, right? One panel, depending on the maker, is about 300 watt. All right, so 400, somewhere in that range, right? So you can put multiple panels and grow it that way. Again, with wind turbines, you can't really do that. And wind turbines, you also need setbacks and stuff like that. They're not necessarily good to put right next to where people live or to where people work. But I think, yes, I think they're both right. I think there's definitely room for both. But I like solar. I like solar with batteries. I think that's a more winning solution, if you will. Oh, okay.
All right, thanks for your presentation. It's great. I think a lot of good information. You mentioned blockchain.
Yep.
But I don't think you went into depth on that.
Oh, sorry. So
do you, yeah, would you
blockchain is
comment-
going to help identify when company X sold the electricity and company Y bought the electricity, and how do you track that, and how do you track the cost or the revenues, depending on which side of the ledger you're on. But how do you track that? And that's where blockchain is really going to come in, because as more companies enter this sector, you're going to have a lot more sellers of electricity. And right now, they're all going through a utility to ultimately sell it to the consumer. But at some point, that might start breaking down. And when that does break down, you need better ways to track, to monitor as to what's happening. But again, this is in the future, right? I mean, this is not something that is currently happening right today.
Well, there's some startups and people active in blockchain today, so I guess it's
sure.
not, yeah. But is this something that Sumitomo is invested in or see as an opportunity, or you have a wait and see attitude about it, let it evolve and then figure out how to get in? You're in more of the asset world than the crypto world or whatever the right word is. So
right, we're not a technology company.
Yeah.
The many things we do, we're probably not a technology. So that is something that we would, we would buy those services from somebody else.
Or would you buy a blockchain company or something like that? Not to ask like.
Yeah, that might be a little challenging for us. Maybe 10 years from now, it's a little bit more of an established industry and a little bit more established companies. We might think about it, but where they are today, it's a little too much risk for us.
Too much risk. You're a more mature
Yeah.
investor buying more mature assets and that kind of. Okay, that makes sense.
I have one more comment for you. But you do know who the customer is.
Sure.
And what the customer's needs are.
Yep.
And I presume you represent that well.
Yes, and that's one of the struggles that we Sumitomo have, but I think a lot of other companies in the industry have, is that we've never sold power to a customer, right? I mean, okay, we have some experience, but generally as a whole, we don't have that experience of knocking down doors. We don't have that experience of saying to people, what can I do for you, right? We have the experience of I sell electricity, you buying it? And that's sort of where it ends, right? And so it's a challenge for just about everybody in the industry to go out there and to sell electrons or sell electricity. And the flip side is also true. The consumers, the customers, don't have experience, right, buying electricity, right? So it is, everybody is learning and going through this process. But some companies like a Google or Microsoft or Apple, they all have, if you will, almost perfected this. And they all have energy procurement teams. But most companies do not have electricity procurement teams. They have procurement teams for whatever products or whatever raw goods they utilize, sure. But they've never sort of taken it to the next step of, I need a procurement team for electricity. They just turn on the light switch, it's there, everything's fine.
Engineer, for the vehicle to grid, that's obviously not an overnight process. What would you say, or what do you think the steps are to kind of turn that into reality? Pilot projects with fleet assets or things like that? What would you say?
Well, first, I mean, it does take some public policy changes. That's why I think Europe will probably lead the way in vehicle to grid applications. There are EV fleets already, right? So, I mean, I can't speak to this area here, but you do see some cities that have EV buses. You do see some EV, like say trash trucks or stuff like that. You see it also in port operations, right, where they're moving away from the container box. I spend a lot of time in the port sector. You see the container boxes have to constantly be moved, right? Because they're always, the box you want is always at the far one of the back, right? And so they always have to move the container boxes around. And that's all it was done by diesel trucks. And so you see that moving into EV as well. So there are some EV fleets that are industrial or heavy usage type fleets. But again, I'm really sort of more biased saying it's probably going to be in Europe where you see a much more adoption of this. And so the EV car share company that we bought has 300 vehicles today. And we hope to grow that to a more, about 1,000 vehicles or 1,500 vehicles. First, you have to have the concept of car sharing take off, right? That's step number one. Step number two is that you also need, these vehicles would need to be charged, and so you need to have charging stations. that are readily accessible, right? In certain cities in Europe, they are. I would say in America, almost not at all, right? The other thing that we're thinking about that we haven't done yet is owning parking garages. You own a parking garage, then you can put the EV charging stations in them, right? And so you need a lot of components to start working for it to take off. So not to be pessimistic, but it's going to be quite some time before vehicle to grid is really quite the force. But once you can get these vehicles connected to the grid, you can start shutting down a lot of power plants that aren't really necessary, that they're there in the what if or the what happens, or that one day in the summertime or the wintertime when you start hitting your peak loads. But all of those can start be shutting down and saving, and then you don't need the transmission because, again, the EVs are really going to be concentrated in city centers mostly, or where the people live, or where the population is, where the load is. And so once you start having that, then you don't need these big hulking coal or gas fire plants in the middle of nowhere with the big transmission wires going along. So it really has the potential to change things. But it'll probably take time. I think distributed gen, solar panels on rooftops, will take off much faster. It's much easier to do. It's much easier of a concept, and it saves you money. I can't speak to your electric rates here, but I can tell you if I had solar panels on my roof at home, I'd be saving money. And that's in New York State where it snows. And I have trees that create all the shade.
I have a question regarding solar. I see the price drop from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Why is it for residential the price hasn't dropped as much?
That's a good question because when you talk about utility scale solar, the panel and the racking system probably account for 60% of the costs. When you talk about residential solar, it's probably 25% of the costs. So yes, that portion has come down. So a solar panel on your home is the same solar panel on a utility scale. It's the same thing. The prices have come down. It's just that when you sort of talk about the proportion of costs, it just hasn't come down as fast. So an efficient installer of panels on a commercial or an industrial level is probably at the $2 a watt pricing, whereas on the utility scale it's probably just under $1. It's probably 95 cents right now. And the difference between those two numbers is not the panels. Racking systems are a little different. It's labor. It's going up, fortifying the roof if necessary, which is sometimes necessary. And the fact that a solar array on a big open field can look the same in field A versus field B. Putting it up on a roof, you have to design it to the specs of that roof. So again, it's a little bit less efficient that way.
Then on a related question is, in terms of transmission line, do you foresee in the future we're going to have more DC transmission lines versus AC just because of renewables? If you were to design a grid from scratch.
I think you'll see some DC lines built. As I said before, there's the beginnings of the lines coming from basically the plain states up into it's a specific market called PJM, but to Illinois or to Indiana or to Tennessee. So you do see some lines going that way. So basically going eastward, and then you see some lines on the other side of the Rockies going towards basically LA and the Southern California basin. So yeah, you might see some of them happen. But practically speaking, less than 10, 3, 4 is probably the right number of these DC transmission lines happening. Whereas the typical transmission line, I mean, they're being built constantly. I mean, you might not say it, but the transmission network is constantly being updated and upgraded, and new transmission lines are being built virtually every day. It's a billion-dollar industry each and every year of new investments into the AC transmission network.
Kind of a follow-on to that question, something that's always mystified me, not so much the difference between commercial, industrial, residential, and utility scale, is really just the difference between utility scale and commercial and industrial scale. If I owned a Walmart, if I owned an H-E-B, if I owned a Home Depot, I would be carpeting the roofs of those places with solar panels, because back to your where the load is point, that's where the load is. No transmission cost, no distribution cost. And the cost differential between commercial, industrial, and utility is much, much smaller and theoretically could be non-existent. Do you have any sense why every time we see these bar charts projecting the future, they still show utility scale as being the largest segment going forward, vice commercial, industrial, and someday residential overtaking that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it is a struggle to answer that. And yes, the difference between utility scale and commercial scale or industrial scale is every company will have a slightly different way they define it, but it's just a definition of size at the end of it, right? Some people say it's over 5 megawatts, some people say it's over 1 megawatt, some people say it's over 10 megawatts, and so depending on who you talk to, they'll have a slightly different definition. But with respect to the big box stores or any sort of store like that, you do see them putting panels on the roofs, right? So Walmart is absolutely doing it. Target is absolutely doing it. All the big vendors are doing it, right? Some of the challenges was first, well, I mean, it's only quite recently that solar has become so cheap. So, if they installed it 5 years ago, they're sort of feeling the pain a little bit from that decision compared to today. The second is that sometimes you need the right regulation in place so that if you have too much generation from your roof, you can sell it back to the grid. Most states actually don't have that, but the more populous states tend to have that. So California has it, New York State has it, or Texas has it. So the big population centers tend to have that type of regulation. So then the other concern is if I'm an asset owner, right? So sometimes, I can't speak to Walmart specifically, but let's say hypothetically company A wants to put it on the roof, they don't want to pay for it. They want me as the asset owner to pay for it. So they want me to come, design the system, install it, and they'll just buy the power from it. How long is that company going to be in that location? Walmart, I feel pretty good about that. I feel great about that. Target, sure, love it. Circuit City, ooh, I don't know about that company, Crazy Eddie's, ooh, what a disaster, right? So, yes, that's the other thing. So a solar investment takes about 12 to 15 years to get your payback. Not simple payback. Simple payback's probably 4 years or 5 years. And so you're really making a bet that company will stay in that location. Not go out of business, but just stay in that location. That's a tough decision. Again, you have to, every company you're going to have to analyze their financials and figure out if that's the right decision. And most of those stores are LLCs anyway, right? So each store is like a little company itself. That's the way they're usually organized. So.
We're almost up. This might be the last question. I'd love your global view about China because you're active all over the world. And I feel like one of the big stories of the 21st century will be what we do about climate change, if anything, and when and how. And one of the other big stories of the 21st century will be the rise of China. And these two are related. Just from your global perspective, with your activity and also just the company's global perspective, what do you think about China and how are they relevant to all of this? Right.
Well, China's always going to be a big player in this sector. So just first with the climate change type question, right? Even in the United States, even not even having signed any sort of treaty, our greenhouse gas emissions are going down. At least significantly down in the power sector. Transportation sector probably steady, if not growing. So you don't necessarily need the Paris Accords to reduce greenhouse gases. What you need is favorable policy, right? That's one way of doing it, but that's not the only way of doing it. In the US, we have tax incentives, and that actually is working. And back to that chart, when you saw the ups and downs, well, the ups were because the tax policy was working, right? So the US actually is doing a lot in terms of reduction of carbon, even though they might not proactively state that. China is different, right? I mean, it's a controlled economy to a certain extent, and I think everyone knows they're building a lot of coal plants there. They're building also a lot of nuclear plants, and they're building a lot of wind plants. And solar, I'm not so sure on. But they are the dominant country in terms of the technology of solar panels. They might not be made in China, but in fact, they're typically made elsewhere. But China absolutely drives the solar market. It is a Chinese technology, bar none. Whereas wind and thermal is, either Western Europe, US, or Korean technology, or Japanese sometimes. And so China will absolutely dominate this, and it's hard to say, will China decarbonize? And I'm going to say yes, because they are going in that direction. They own all the solar technology, and so they have the ability to do it. It's just that sometimes a priority of certain countries is to get the population or to get the country electrified first. And I think that's where China is right now, is that, of course, the major cities have electricity, but getting the electricity to some of the smaller villages might be a more paramount of importance. And then once you have that, then moving into the solar or the wind. But again, China is huge in both of these technologies. And there's many Chinese wind turbine manufacturers as well. They aren't quite tested yet to be certified here in the US or in Western Europe. But it's just a matter of time before that happens. But yeah, I think it's going to be a major force. I mean, you see it in South America, right? So some of the bigger competitors in South America are Chinese state-owned entities that are coming in, bringing their own workforce, bringing their own export credit financing, bringing their own panels. It's really hard to compete against them. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the seminar, and please join me in thanking Bo Cannon, everyone.
Hey.
And then whoever wants to join us, Schultz's Garden in just a few minutes.
All right.